My name is Ingrid Bachmann. I'm the Graduate Program Director of the MFA Studio Arts, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you tonight to another edition of Conversations in Contemporary Art. Before we introduce our speaker, I'd like to tell you about another interesting and important event we're having next week, which is the annual MFA Open Studios Porte Ouverte, Wednesday from 6 to 9 and Thursday from 6 to 9. And all of you are welcome to come to the VA, this building, and the EV, and to look at the graduate students and their work. They'll be present in their studios, and it's a nice opportunity to see the next generation of Quebec and Canada's talent in their studios. We're also having a publication launch of the catalog that celebrates the work of the MFA students, so we hope to see you next week as well. Now I'd like to invite Professor Linda Swanson to introduce our speaker, Del Harrow.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for coming out tonight for the lecture. I've been fortunate to know Del Harrow since we went to graduate school together at Alfred University in New York. Del is originally from Oregon and has taught sculpture and ceramics at the Oregon College of Art and Craft, the Kansas City Art Institute, Pennsylvania State University, and he currently teaches at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, where he has founded a digital research center. He's also taught numerous workshops and at residency programs like Anderson Ranch in Colorado and Haystack in Maine. Del is always innovating. He brings a material sensibility to digital processes and gives a tangibility to technology through the combination and juxtaposition of forms produced in multiple ways. His practice is prolific, and his work has been exhibited internationally in places like New York, Kansas City, Milwaukee, China, and Holland. He recently curated the exhibition New Morphologies, Studio Ceramics, and Digital Processes at the Shine Joseph International Museum of Ceramic Art, and organized and moderated the Data Clay Symposium that brought together architects, artists, and designers interested in coupling ceramics with new technologies, held just last week at the California College of Art. So let's give a warm welcome to Del Harrow.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and thank you, Linda, for the introduction and for inviting me out, and Ingrid for coordinating this lecture series and inviting me to be a part of it, and also to Emily for all of your work kind of organizing things in advance of the visit. It was kind of really fun. The last couple of days I've been having a great time meeting with some of you in your studios, and it's interesting. Someone asked earlier today if it was typical to do the lecture at the end of a visit rather than at the beginning. And often when I've visited places, the lecture has happened at the beginning, and then you go into studios and people kind of maybe know what to expect a little bit from what you're going to talk to them about in their studios. But I think it's really fun to kind of flip that because it gave me a little bit of time to maybe massage my talk a bit and hopefully sort of focus on some things that you all might be more interested in, hopefully. So I'm going to talk about a number of projects that I've worked on. Linda mentioned some of these, this Data Clay Symposium, which I organized, also some of my work at Colorado State University, where I teach. And in the talk, I'll kind of zoom in from there onto my studio and what I do there as an artist. One of the things I'm really interested in is this kind of moving in and out, so moving out to curatorial practice or doing work in terms of kind of bringing people together from different disciplines to talk about ceramics and digital fabrication and materials, and then kind of moving into this really direct, literally this work that happens at the tip of your fingers, so I'm kind of manipulating and moving clay. This project, which I've been working on for a few years now, is a collaboration with an architect in Los Angeles named Joshua Stein. And this project is called the Data Clay Network. And it's all about bringing together practitioners from architecture, design, and studio art who are exploring the intersection of ceramics, clay, and digital technology. And it feels like this really exciting time right now in the ceramics field where clay is both like a really cool material kind of in the fine art world right now, which is, good and bad. And then there's also a tremendous amount of interest in physical materials, I think, and clay specifically, from fields like architecture and design. So this project involves this website, which we put together, and this is kind of an archive of different artist, architect, designer projects. It also collects really technical information on some of the processes these artists are working. And then Joshua and I also curated an exhibition that's up currently at the San Francisco Museum of Art and Design, and then put together this symposium, which was held just last week at California College of Art. And we brought a bunch of different people in to speak at this symposium. One artist whose practice I think is really, really amazing is an architect named Ron Rial, and he's a professor of architecture at University of California, Berkeley. And he's doing this incredible work with 3D printing, but a really wide range of experimental materials. So he's 3D printing in clay, in concrete, in wood, and this is actually this kind of pavilion that he printed out of salt. But one of the things that is really kind of central to my interest in digital technology, and something we really wanted to bring into this symposium, is both how digital technology and ceramics are related and complementary, but also how they're two sort of structures often that kind of interrupt or resist one another. So the complexity and kind of fecundity of clay can be quite contrary to the sort of precision of many digital tools and techniques. And we wanted to bring some of that idea, some of that kind of feeling into the symposium. And we were talking, kind of planning the symposium event beforehand, and we just started asking people, like, what was missing from a symposium about digital fabrication and ceramics. And the artist John Roloff, who's been a part of this network, he just said, I think what's missing is the smell of clay. So we decided to bring in someone to basically kind of interrupt the symposium, sort of mess it up, to bring in some of this complexity and fecundity into this often very sort of sterile, cerebral, kind of intellectual space of the symposium. So we asked this artist named Michael Swain, who's part of a group called Future Farmers. We asked him to come and bring the smell of clay into this auditorium. This is documentation of a project that Michael has worked on for years, actually. I think he's been working on this project for about 15 years, where once a week he goes into the Tenderloin in San Francisco and he brings this sewing machine and he just mends clothing for free. So that just gives you a little bit of a flavor of his practice. So he came into the symposium and we had people, up on stage like a typical symposium, kind of talking about, smart, complex, technical ideas. And at the same time, Michael had hooked up these two big industrial fans, and he was blowing cheesecloth that had been dipped in clay out onto the audience. So this is another project which Linda mentioned briefly, but so I teach at Colorado State University. My appointment initially was one half in ceramics, and actually our ceramics department is called a pottery area. It's still called pottery, and we've retained that name for a number of reasons, which we can maybe talk about later. One of those reasons is it's sometimes kind of provocative to keep a name like that, so there may be questions about it. And then I also teach in the sculpture area there at CSU. And then a project that I've been very involved in is building this lab for digital fabrication. We have a range of different tools in this lab. At this point, we've been able to build a space to house these tools. We've been able to hire a really amazing technician named Scott Kreider to provide access for all of the tooling. We have a couple of laser cutters, a couple of large CNC milling machines, and then this last summer we were able to enclose this space, which used to be an open courtyard, so we were able to build a roof over this space and create a computer lab that's all dedicated to digital fabrication tools. And I actually think this space is one of the most important things that we've built in conjunction with this lab, because what it's done is it's created an actual physical studio where students can spend time together working with software, and it started to create this kind of studio culture with this tool set that's all around digital kind of technology. The other kind of part of this project that I've spent a lot of time with is to start thinking about how this digital tool set is integrated into our curriculum at CSU. And I feel like that's this really big question that's kind of in the air right now. My thinking is that I think this tool set should be both a service area, so something that's accessible to any students in the department and also the university, but that it's important to also have courses that are dedicated to digital fabrication that allow students to kind of dig beneath the surface, like mess with the tools, hack the tools, kind of mess things up. So as a way of thinking about these curricular questions, over the last couple of years, I've had the opportunity to invite in a series of artists to teach a course for one semester each. And the only guideline has been that the course uses all of the tools in the digital fabrication lab. And then I've also invited practitioners specifically whose work is really at this intersection of digital fabrication and craft. So artists who have a training in, an interest in, for whom craft is a sort of integral part of their practice. So one of the artists we invited in to teach this class is a really amazing and innovative studio potter named Andy Bremen. This is some of his work. He's doing some really exciting things with using data collection to shape his work using CNC milling machines and also decal printing technology. This is this really amazing kind of retrofitted CNC milling machine that Andy built, and what it does is it applies an overglazed decoration to ceramic pieces. So it kind of gets at one of these really exciting kind of potential ideas in digital fabrication, that digital tools can create a production system in which every object is potentially unique without any additional kind of cost and tooling. And so when Andy taught this class, it was really like a kind of tinkering, tool building, kind of tool hacking sort of class. The students built machines and tried to break the machines we have in productive ways, mostly. And this is Stacy Jo Scott. She's a recent graduate of Cranbrook Academy of Art. She has a really different kind of practice. When she taught the course, it was a very kind of theoretical class, really exploring the kind of implications of open source technology and kind of open distribution of information on our culture today. And then the most recent artists we had in to teach this course were Dries Verbruggen and Claire Vernier, and they form a design team called Unfold. They're based in Antwerp in Belgium, and they trained at a really well-known design academy called Eindhoven in Holland, which is where drogue design came from, Helle Jongerius, many really well-known Dutch designers. And they have a really wide-reaching design practice, and they really sort of taught the course through these ideas, and it's called kind of European free design. So this is one project that they've become pretty well known for in the ceramics kind of community, the ceramics world. It's a hacked 3D printer which has been hacked and retrofitted to print with a porcelain slip. And they have a number of projects that have kind of spun out of this technology that they developed. These are some pieces they printed, which I think just kind of show some of the really interesting potential of applying 3D printing to ceramics, where you can build all these really complex sort of interior structures, something that would be really difficult to do with coil building or slip casting, for example, more traditional kinds of techniques. I invited Dries to come out to Alfred University a few years ago when I curated a show there, and Dries taught a workshop for a couple of days. And one of the things we started playing around with were students would coil build a form, and then we'd like 3D print on top of it to kind of mix up like the sort of these really handmade forms with that precision of the digital tool. And then one of the things Dries is really interested in also is how the kind of messiness of clay, the complexity of clay materials can sort of interrupt this precision of the 3D printing. So when you're printing, you can really kind of like mess with the air pressure on the printer, and you sort of turn it up, and all of a sudden like the slip just starts sort of spewing out and creating these really complex sort of knitted structures. And these are some of the things we were playing around with in these pictures. This is a final project of Dries and Claire's, just to kind of show you the spectrum of their studio practice. So this is a piece that they made for the Design Biennial in London a few years ago, and it's a kind of 3D printing kiosk. And so what they did was they took this kiosk around the biennial, and it's outfitted with a number of 3D printers and then also some 3D scanners. And they went around the biennial and scanned other people's work and then printed it and sold it out of this kiosk as little tchotchkes. Here's the detail of that kiosk. And they actually won like one of the awards for the biennial, first prize or second prize for the best design. But then the organizers told them, well, they can show the piece, but they can't show any of the work they printed because there might be copyright violations. I thought was great, like if you can kind of get to that point of sort of messing up this whole conversation. We did a pretty good job. Okay. And then finally, one more project from our digital fabrication lab. This is from a class that I actually taught last semester, so occasionally I'll teach courses through this lab. And this was a project in collaboration with a potter named Allegheny Meadows, who's based up in Aspen, Colorado. And for about 15 years, he's been working with this project called the ArtStream Nomadic Gallery. So what this is an Airstream trailer that he's transformed into a portable gallery space. And it's been all over the country. It shows some of the very best studio pottery being made in the United States today. And so last semester, Allegheny approached me to think about creating an interior for the next ArtStream. So this Airstream trailer was kind of breaking down. I think one of the axles is on its last legs. And so he wanted to make a new version of this interior. So we taught a course last semester where the entire class was a design build class, where I worked with a group of students to design and then actually fabricate this new Airstream trailer interior. so we thought one of the first things we should do is to actually build a model, sort of build a model of the trailer. So the first modeling assignment was to make a 3D CAD model of an Airstream trailer and then unfold it, and then we had it cut, water jet cut out of aluminum, and then riveted together an Airstream trailer that's about like this long, this big. It's kind of actually a pretty complex modeling project, and I still want to price it out to see what you could make a full-scale one for. You could just scale that up and get a water jet cut out, and then people could buy them and you could flat pack it, rivet your own together. And then this is a model for one of the interior designs. That kind of gives you a sense of scale of that model. Through this class, we got to get into all of these different things. I mean, from kind of design methodologies in sort of a broad sense, all the way down to the real specifics of working with wood and material, and how you stick things together, how you think about joinery. So it really felt like it was an incredibly kind of fulfilling class to teach. Here are some students in the shop actually assembling the full-scale piece. And then here's a detail. And unfortunately, I don't have an image of the final piece installed, but it's going to be touring around the United States this year. It'll go to the NCCA conference, which is the big kind of national ceramics conference, and it'll tour around the East Coast of the States. And then it's actually, after that, it's going to go on a shipping container, and it'll be shipped to Europe, and it'll go on tour in Europe. So it'll go all over the place. This is Camila, an amazing special student that we have in the program right now. And this is actually a project that Camila just built. Camila has a really amazing background where she was actually in a PhD program for mathematics before she came to work in our ceramics program. So she has this kind of perfect mind for this intersection of digital technology and clay. So I'll kind of move now into some of my work in the studio. So I'm going to talk for a while about digital techniques and digital technology, but that's sort of just one part of my interest in the studio and in my work. Something I think a lot about is both the kind of advantages and benefits of digital technology, but also some of the limitations. So I think that often people kind of talk about the advantages of digital technology in terms of these things on the left, which are speed, efficiency, scalability, sort of the obvious things that digital tools can kind of do for us. And what I'm much more interested in as an artist is really trying to look at both digital tools, but also a range of things that are made by humans, made by the hand through all sorts of different techniques, and try to look at them outside of this context of, how they work within the kind of sort of capitalist framework, right? And to really look at them for their own aesthetic qualities. So these are some ideas that I've just kind of laid out for myself to think about this notion of the aesthetics of digital craft. And I won't really read or talk about them, but it's just something to maybe think about, sort of hold in your minds. And then another thinker, which has been really sort of formative, and who's been really formative and important for me in thinking about digital technology and digitally made things in relation to kind of handmade things is David Pye, a woodworker and writer. And he talks about this idea of the workmanship of certainty and the workmanship of risk as a kind of continuum that is a more complex way of thinking about what we typically articulate as a kind of dichotomy between the handmade and the machine-made. And so he sort of says anything made by humans sits somewhere on this continuum, right? So through the introduction of tools, the idea is to move things towards the workmanship of certainty, where we can make things in a more precise way. We can kind of take out this variation, this variability of the hand. But historically, the kind of downfall of moving things towards a more mechanized kind of process has been that you lose variation, that you lose variability in the products. But then digital technology kind of introduces this other possibility, right? We saw that kind of in Andy Bremen's work, that it allows you to make things with an incredible degree of variation, but in a really fast and precise sort of way. Stuff. So I'm going to show you guys a few projects to start with, and then there are sort of a few layers. So we can kind of think of this work as kind of building up through these layers. But the starting point, so we've got all this stuff about digital technology. One thing. Ceramics is also a big part of my thinking, so that's kind of my background. It comes from ceramics and studio ceramics, and I think that ideas that are sort of germane to ceramics often serve as a starting point for me in the work. So one of those ideas is the idea of repetition and variation, or tessellation, basically like how to make something big out of a bunch of small parts in a way that's interesting. And this is a real sort of fundamental idea to ceramics in architecture specifically, and it sort of makes a lot of sense if you think about it. Like, ceramics is this great material to use in architecture in a lot of ways. Like, it's really permanent, it takes color really, really well, but then on the other hand, it's actually a really strong material, but when it fails catastrophically. Right? Makes sense. You also need a kiln big enough to fire any given component. So for a really, really long time, ceramic artists, craftsmen, architects have been thinking about ways to make something interesting by assembling modules, and better yet, repeated modules together to create something larger. So this is a really amazing historical example of that idea. On the left is the facade of a mosque in Esfahan in Iran, and there's this really particular tiling system here, present here, which is something called Penrose Tiling. And what it is there are 5 different shapes, 5 different repeating shapes, but when they tessellate together, when they fit together, they tessellate in a way that's non-repeating, right? So there's no symmetry in the pattern. And this is kind of, incredible, right? This is an idea that's sort of at the foundations of things like fractal geometry. This is actually a mathematical concept that wasn't worked out in the West until the 1970s. But in, 1453, craftsmen working with clay sort of figured this out by cutting clay shapes apart and sticking them together. And I think this is a really, really interesting idea. The notion that maybe those craftsmen didn't completely understand this as a kind of abstract mathematical concept, but that by working through materials, we discover these incredibly complex systems and complex ideas. So here's a project that I've been working on for a few years. It uses a different kind of tessellating form. This is a shape that tessellates not just 2-dimensionally, but 3-dimensionally. And this is a shape called a truncated octahedron. And I first came across this shape through that same really kind of empirical sort of exploration. So without any digital technology at all, I was just cutting little polygons out of foam core, taping them together, and then looking for interesting shapes that would nest together. And then from there, I started making molds off of those, slip casting them in clay, and stacking these forms together and playing with them. So this piece on the left was the first in this series of pieces, sort of using this form as the underlying geometry. And this is a big stack of they're black slip-cast porcelain forms. This is another iteration of that same set of pieces, and I'll kind of talk about this a little bit more later, but one of the things that is exciting for me in working in this way is it's kind of like you make a bunch of parts and then you go into a gallery or a space to install the work, and every time the installation's a little bit different. So you can really like kind of play and respond to the architecture of the space when you're configuring the piece. So I've kind of continued to work with the same kind of shape, and I was interested in sort of moving it forward and creating another version that kind of opened up some porosity, like opened up a kind of interior space. And so an idea like that about basically about form, about geometry, those kinds of ideas are often really operative for me when I'm thinking about what I'm going to make. And then I'm always kind of thinking back through the material and through the way the thing is going to be made. So I'm really interested in the way those parts kind of come together. So here, I'm kind of moving over into a digital model for this piece. And I wanted to kind of soften that shape as well. So here you see an algorithm is applied to that really kind of rectilinear geometry to soften it and turn it into a more organic shape. And then I had to start thinking about how you break that up. And I wanted to slip cast this, so you have to kind of start thinking about what the limitations of slip casting are. So here's another kind of algorithm that's applied to it that starts to divide this really complex shape into pieces. And then this next step, there was a lot of kind of intuition for me involved in this next step of kind of looking at this big complex mass and thinking about what a good element to pick out would be and try to select something that if I made a lot of them, it would reproduce this larger kind of overall geometry. So this little kind of dog bone shape was the piece that I ended up choosing. And then for this particular piece, and this is kind of common in my work, I'm not using something like 3D printing, which is an additive process. I make a lot of things using what's called a CNC milling machine. So instead of building something up, I'm actually using this machine which carves material away. And so here on the right, that's this little shape kind of all laid out, ready for the CNC machine. And it's really interesting. So one of the limitations of the CNC machines that I have to work with, and there are more complex ones, but the ones that I'm working with is they're what's called a 3-axis CNC machine. So that means they move like this, and up and down, but they don't turn, right? So they can basically mill like one face of something. But what's really interesting is if you think about that in relation to slip casting, I don't know how many of you are familiar with slip casting or mold making, but when you're slip casting, you also have to divide a form up into parts which don't have any undercuts. Right? So all of a sudden, the limitations of making a mold are exactly the same as the limitations of the CNC milling machine. So I kind of realized through this that if I, instead of thinking about making a complete object, if I thought about using the CNC milling machine to mill the parts of the mold, all of those problems, all of those limits kind of disappear. So this is the way I was working through this piece. So I'm milling here. These are all the shapes milled out, the parts of the mold, and they're basically molds for the mold parts milled out of foam. So then you take these shapes and you pour plaster into them, and then you pop those plaster parts out of your first mold, and then you stick these mold pieces together, and then actually the first time that you ever see the fully realized three-dimensional piece is when the porcelain piece pops out of the mold at the end. So it's kind of really exciting. Like, you don't ever go through this prototype stage in another material, right? You just start casting and you just start getting the real parts out. So for those of you who aren't familiar with slip casting, this is the slip casting process. Watching slip dry there. So you pour this porcelain slip into this mold, you pour it back out, and it leaves a thin shell of porcelain on the outside of the mold. And then these elements are really great because you can just paint a little bit of porcelain slip onto them and stick them together. And so you can start building them into these larger modules. So here I'm kind of looking for a sort of brick in a way, right? I'm going from a little brick to a kind of bigger brick or a bigger unit, trying to find something that'll fit into my kiln and something that you can sort of stack with and move around. So this is a group of fired parts, and it's like really exciting. Like now they sort of tessellate and grow in 3 dimensions. So you can keep kind of building these pieces out and out and out. And this is what this looked like as a sculpture, but I could have kept going with this, obviously. I just kind of have a question with these modular pieces about how much they should grow, what kind of the optimal state for them is as a sculpture, which is sort of endpoint for me for the work, even though I think it maybe has other applications. And then this is kind of a third iteration where this is using actually that same geometry, but here moving to an entirely different material, and actually thinking about the form in a really different way. And I won't explain this really much further, but this is, it has the same underlying kind of 3-dimensional tessellating shape here, but it's made all out of water jet cut aluminum. And this was another kind of really exciting place in terms of that idea of making something that I could really explore like within the gallery itself. So this is a kind of chandelier that I built, and it's actually about 13 feet tall, so it's this fairly large form, but the whole thing packs down into a box that's about this big. And so you kind of, mail this little box to the gallery, and you like spend a couple days with a rivet gun, and you build it, and you can really kind of think about how this volume like works within the volume of the gallery space. Another idea, again, that I feel is really kind of germane to ceramics is this idea of typology and morphology. So the form of the vessel, and then the idea that form sort of evolves through iterative sequence. This is a really interesting chart from Philip Rawson's book called Ceramics, which just explores this kind of family tree, sort of morphological evolution of pottery forms. This is another example of a similar kind of chart, but it comes from a completely different field. This is actually from this study of, it's called a study of cognitive linguistics. And so an anthropologist actually came up with this, anthropologist and linguist came up with this chart. And the way it was used was this chart was developed and then transformed into a series of flashcards. And it was used as a way of mapping language. So the researcher took these flashcards and started traveling around Mexico to different areas, and they'd show the flashcards to people, and they'd ask you, like, what is this one called? And then what is this one called? And then what is this one called? And they would chart where the name of a cup turned into a jar, right? Or a vase turned into a bowl. So it was used to kind of map the way transitions in language, the way language sort of works and varies from region to region. And it was actually based on this other study, which they have some amazing illustrations of in the same book, where instead of pottery form, they used boots to map these same transitions, like boots on your feet, right? And so they had like these morphological charts of one kind of boot transforming into another kind of boot, right? And they went to the United Kingdom and Texas, and they found the most boot, like the boot with the highest degree of bootness in each of those locations. And it's like really telling, it's really interesting. So, morphology. So this was a piece that I made kind of exploring, thinking about that idea of the kind of the sort of iterative evolution of form, and actually made this piece for an exhibition that Linda and I were in together. It was first shown at the Northern Clay Center. And then the other kind of part of this piece is it really became about this idea that potters often talk about, sort of describe the form of pots in terms of the parts of the body, sort of anthropomorphized pottery form. So there's this idea of pots as having a kind of breath, which potters often talk about. And it's one of those ideas that I felt like I always kind of understood intuitively, but in another way didn't quite understand. And this piece, in a sense, was a way of kind of really trying to look at that notion. So the piece is based on these two historical forms. One is a British apothecary jar, and the other is a Sung Dynasty vase. And this kind of came from going through museum websites and trying to find an object that seemed like exemplified the extremes of breath. So the extreme of exhaling and inhaling. And then I modeled these digitally and again created a little algorithm that sort of morphs between the two forms. And then I wanted to turn these into physical objects. And initially what I thought I'd do is kind of use that same CNC milling process that I showed you, and I would carve a bunch of molds on the CNC machine and then cast a bunch of forms, and I'd have a bunch of molds and a bunch of forms. But then what I thought would be more interesting maybe is to see if I could create a whole series of forms but using just one mold. So this is the first, it's actually, maybe this is the first shape in this sort of continuum. I created 11 sort of steps between those two extremes of breath. So I take the first form, cast it in porcelain, and then instead of making another mold, I took the mold and put it back on the milling machine and carved more material away. So you get this mold, which is usually this really kind of rigid, fixed sort of structure or tool in the studio, and you turn it into something that's plastic in a way, that's malleable. So this is that same mold after 3 or 4 different iterations. This is the process of carving the mold on the mill from one stage to the next. And then this is the mold with a bunch of forms in the studio and the process of casting pieces. And then this is what the complete kind of gradient looks like. The other thing I did with this, I'm really interested in often the kind of artifacts of the tool or the tooling process. So you can see that the line of the milling machine leaves these subtle kind of striations in the form, and as a way to kind of play with that and keep a record of that through the process. With each subsequent form that was milled, I just rotated the axis of the tool path by 16 degrees. So through the entire series, it rotates 180 degrees. And then there are parts of the mold that are removed, and there are also parts of the mold that are left behind. So you see these different layers of tooling kind of building up through the process. And then this other part, I often find when working in digital technology, working inside of the software, there's often this there's a kind of beautiful structure to the way that the model looks inside of the computer, And I kind of think about, I sort of trace it back to things like artists like Paolo Uccello and like the first development of Renaissance perspective, It's like the beauty of seeing or showing the way that we see space kind of illustrated. I don't know, I think there are a lot of parts to it. I'm also really interested again in bringing some of that like into the space of an exhibition, like kind of sharing some of that, those qualities as a part of the work. But then I'm also very interested, of course, in giving that the sort of structured kind of digital diagram a sort of physicality or materiality. So this was an idea that I kind of came up with for exploring that within an actual work that I would show. So this is a piece that was made by just layering up all of these digital models, and then instead of just printing them, I made this attachment that plugs into our CNC milling machine, and it just turns it into a big drawing tool. So it's just like a little spring-loaded pencil holder. But then what's really interesting about it, it takes about 5 hours to do one of these drawings with the milling machine, and like the pencil keeps getting dull as you're drawing, so you like have to stop the machine and like sharpen the pencil, and sometimes it kind of tears into the paper. And there's actually there's a kind of tremor it's either in the stepper motors or in the gears of the tool. So there's this little vibration that happens, that comes out in the drawing. And all of those things feel really important. They're layers to the quality of the final piece. So this is what the piece looks like in the exhibition. Speed up a little bit. And this is kind of another version of the same piece shown in a different way. I made a series of 5 of these. So it's really what I'm always kind of searching for in the work is it's a place kind of in the middle of this sort of Venn diagram, a sort of poetic confluence of form, material, and process. Another way of thinking about that is material, geometry, and technology. And of course, digital technology is one kind of structure, right? It's one kind of mode of working, but I'm also really deeply invested in very traditional and kind of skill-based and manual building techniques. And I'd say of any kind of like way of building, probably my favorite way to work with clay is through coiling and pinching. So that has remained a really kind of fundamental part of my practice. And I think about this in a lot of ways. I really think that the ways we choose to work and the tools that we use have this real deep effect on the pace of our thinking, the things we think about. I think they're really fundamental to the way we think. And so for me, like this kind of movement between technologies, between ways of manipulating material, feels really integrally important. This is a series of pieces that I've been working on where they're built entirely with coils and pinching, but what I'm doing is I'm trying to apply the rules of a digital model to a totally manually or coil-built object. So it's built with coils up from the bottom. It's a volume of a certain size. The only rules really are I want to make the biggest thing that'll possibly fit inside of my kiln. And then I want every surface to resolve as a triangle or a mesh, which is kind of a fundamental form in digital representation. So all of these things I was just showing you, I really think these technologies, right, these ideas that are kind of germane to ceramics, they're really kind of a starting point in my studio. I'm really interested in the way they perform in that sense. Like, they're a great way to kind of generate ideas. But the other part of them is I often think, like any technologies that we use, they tend to create certain ways of seeing the world and certain blind spots, in a sense. And so I feel like I have this other kind of layer to my practice where I'm really interested in exploring or creating space for the kind of unexpected or the intuitive, like connections between things, this sort of slippage between things that we had sort of planned and kind of cordoned off as one sort of idea or one kind of piece. So I'm really fascinated with the way that often when you're working in the studio, like you'll be really focusing on one piece, and then you'll get tired of it, or you'll move on to something else, and you sort of put this thing over in the periphery, right? You sort of just stick it somewhere. You stick it on a table, or you stick it on a shelf, and you're not even thinking about it. It ends up next to something else, right? And maybe you come back to that weeks or months later, and suddenly you realize that there's this really important resonance or conversation happening between these two things that felt completely unrelated. So I feel like I have a few kinds of structures for creating space for that kind of idea. And one is to think through this idea of the installation, right? So to make these forms or sculptures, like some of the things you saw, but then bring them into the space of the gallery without a completely preconceived notion about how they are going to work or where the boundaries of one thing and another are going to start and end. And I really feel like that fluidity, the kind of plasticity of the studio is the starting point of that part of the work. This is just a photograph I took of a wall of my studio. The kind of origin of this idea for me really came from, I've been thinking about it for a long time, but I feel like I was really able to kind of name it in a way and start to explore it in a more kind of explicit way by thinking through the work of the sculptor Constantin Brancusi, and actually going and visiting his studio outside of the Pompidou Center was a really sort of formative experience. I went there when I was about 19 years old. And then this is actually an installation that I made at Oregon College of Art and Craft. This was a site-specific installation that I made for the NCCA conference when it was there in Portland. And this piece was made, instead of creating all of these objects and then shipping the objects to the site, instead the way this worked was I created all of the molds for these objects and then shipped the molds to the site and then built all of the forms there and then constructed this kind of building which operated as a sort of temporary frame for this kind of composition of forms. And then at the end of the exhibition, everything kind of went away. These are a couple of photographs. On the left is a photograph that Brancusi actually took of his own studio. And it's really interesting. I'm sure all of you are familiar with his work. I think typically his work is thought about as these kind of discrete objects. But what I think is incredibly interesting about his practice is that actually the objects within the context of the studio were as important as a piece as the objects in isolation. And he had this sort of parallel practice to sculpting like physical form, which was photographing the studio space. Actually, the first exhibition of his work that was ever shown in the United States was at Stieglitz's gallery, and it was an exhibition of his photographs. I'm really interested actually in the pairing of these two photographs. So on the left is Brancusi's studio and a photograph he took of the space. And then on the right is the studio as it exists now outside of the Pompidou. And it was, this space was kind of redesigned by the architect Renzo Piano, who took all of Brancusi's work and kind of cleaned it up and sort of recomposed it. I just think, I'm not really sure what this means, right? There's a kind of messiness to the image on the left, right? there's a sort of clarity. This has kind of been represented and reorganized and sort of curated on the right. But I think about the pairing of these two images a lot. I'm thinking about the relationship between the studio and the gallery and what the similarities and differences here are. So this is an installation that I made a few years ago for a large exhibition at the Denver Art Museum. It's an installation that's made up of these three parts. The largest of the three pieces is this wall, which involved building a wall that extended from an existing interior wall in the gallery. And this wall is, so I built that wall, and then it's covered on both sides with these large tiles. So that wall is about 14 feet tall, and the tiles vary in size from a 3 foot by 2 foot tile, and then they sort of compress as you move from the top to the bottom of the wall. There's the other side of the wall, and it's housed inside of this Daniel Lévesque wing of the Denver Art Museum here. What I was really interested in when Lévesque talks about this building, he really kind of talks about how it works within the Colorado landscape. So the way it kind of sits between mountains and sky, right? So this relationship between kind of atmosphere and then the kind of architectonic geometry of the Rocky Mountains. And I was really interested in taking something of that idea and kind of bringing it into the gallery space. So the color in this wall is actually, the subtle gradient you see there is actually in the glaze. So it's about, I think, 9 different glazes that move from the bottom of the wall to the top of the wall. And the color comes from this small addition of copper carbonate in the glaze. So it just moves from a tiny percentage, I don't know, 0.5% or something of copper carbonate at the bottom to no colorant at the top. And I was really interested in this idea that, I think it's a sort of fundamental idea to ceramics, and something I think Linda explores a lot in her work, but this idea that the mineralogical can be transformed into something that feels almost atmospheric. And I love this idea that copper, which was mined in the Rocky Mountains, right? So it's kind of like an essence that's taken out of the mineralogy of the mountains. It can be transformed into color, right? And something that almost dissolves as sort of atmosphere or sky. Kind of my hope piece. The other kind of part of this that was really interesting in building it is that so all of these tiles, there are about 90 tiles, and they were all pressed by hand into molds. And as I started making them, there were a lot of little glitches and variations in the tiles, just like figuring out the technique of making them. But over time, I realized that that other layer, again, of texture, of variability, was really important in the piece. But then at the end of the piece, of course, you get really good at making something. So by the end, everyone was perfect. So on the final, quarter of the pieces, I actually would have to pop them out of the molds and then go and mess them up again to create consistent inconsistency. And then here are a final few photographs of an installation in a gallery space that I've been working with for a number of years now. This is a gallery which I show with pretty often in Kansas City, Missouri, and this just kind of gives you a sense of what this range of work looks like in another kind of a context. I really kind of love this gallery as a frame, as a kind of volume, and I have another show coming up here in mid-March, and it was just kind of incredibly exciting for me to go into this space and really feel like you get to kind of, you get to complete the work in a way. You get to play, it's like almost the most exciting part of the process for me. So one final kind of complicating structure that I think about is, we talked a little bit about architecture, and then the still life is sort of like architecture, but at a smaller scale, I think. And one of the ideas, this is just an image of something that I was thinking about in the studio right before I left, and I think it gets at this idea within these compositions that, you know, the space between things is often as important as the objects themselves. This is another piece that I think of as a kind of still life. Going over on time, so just show you a few more pictures. This is something, another piece I'm working on right now in the studio. And one final image, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we'll open it up for some questions.
Sure. I read that often your works begin with a digital drawing, and I was wondering if by creating ceramics through technology, does that kind of perhaps annul the idea of the craft?
Let's see, does it annul the
If
idea
it's kind of rejecting the idea
of craft? Yeah.
by using technology.
Yeah, I don't think it does at all. I mean, I think technology has been sort of, in some sense, fundamental to craft basically throughout its history, or some kind of tooling. And I think tooling is, you know, I'm not sure if it's technically synonymous with technology. They mean the same thing. Are they the same thing? Yeah, we should look that up. Yeah. So, I mean, I think about, you know, about technology, like, I kind of think about, there's like this sort of historical continuum of technology. So maybe like 3D printing is at one end, right? And you can draw this really long timeline. And somewhere on that continuum is like the potter's wheel, you know? Right? It's probably, it'd have to be a pretty long line to fit the potter's wheel onto that continuum, right? What's that? Go ahead.
Well, exactly, since it's so far away and like it's not at all the same kind of technology we have today than they had then.
Right.
So
Yeah.
what is that?
Yeah. So then another way of thinking about it is, again, that, and I think maybe this is getting at what you're kind of talking about, is the relationship or the presence of the hand in the finished piece, you know? And I think it kind of comes back to that idea from David Pye, like that continuum of the workmanship of certainty to the workmanship of risk. And I think that's something that we often associate with craft or craftsmanship, is that there's the presence of some kind of manual skill, right? A kind of coordination that's essential to both producing the piece, but also the aesthetic kind of qualities, you know, the textures and marks that are present in the work. And I think that's a really interesting question, right? Like, so we've talked about a number of different digital pieces where there's a kind of variation, right? In many cases, you know, it's coming from either like a mechanical problem, right, in the tools, or in some cases it's a kind of variation that you can actually program, like variation into the piece through algorithms. You can include randomness in the piece, and so it becomes this really nuanced kind of it's a nuanced sort of continuum of texture, right? And the way, and it has to do with the way we not just read texture and variation, but the way we like see and feel texture and variation. So I think that digital technology, I don't think it, what did you say? How did you use the word? You said annuls or rejects. Yeah. I don't think it annuls or rejects. I think it continues, like this kind of ongoing sort of set of questions surrounding craft that feel really present in our culture. And I think what it does is, I think the introduction of technology, and hopefully in the way I'm using it, I hope, like ideally, I think it would sort of like split some of these questions apart. You know what I mean? So I'm actually working on a piece right now where I'm trying to take this on, like in a really kind of specific way. So I'm trying to create an algorithm that just draws a line, but draws a line that looks like a line drawn by hand. And it's like a really complicated thing, actually. It kind of came out of this conversation I was having with a kinesiologist at Penn State, so someone who studies like the movement of the hand. And there's like this really interesting thing happening. Like you can kind of see this. You can do it like right here. If you like just hold out your hand and you have somebody else kind of like push on it, right? There's this kind of bouncing that happens, right? You're sort of like, your brain and your muscles are trying to find an equilibrium. Yeah? So that's like kind of one part, and it's like you could kind of model this as like a sine curve, right? You're sort of searching, you're trying to find your way sort of towards something, right? So there's a sine curve, and then there's kind of a dampening of the sine curve. But then depending on a lot of things, like most of us have some degree of tremor in our hands. So that's kind of like, it's kind of like a randomness then that's introduced into that. So I'm not sure, it's not like there's a kind of productive reason, like I don't want to like fake handmade things to make money or something, you know? But I think I'm really like fascinated in like how do you sort of like take these questions apart, you know? And how can technology be not just a tool for making things, but to really like ask a question about like, in a sense, like what it means to be human.
I'm gonna read my question.
Yeah.
Just read it louder.
Yeah, it kind of is in a different direction, but speaking to your role as a teacher. So as an educator in the Art University institution and someone who seems to value interdisciplinary approaches and cross-reference kind of nuanced practices, what are your thoughts surrounding the tendency towards interdisciplinary structures as a kind of trending shift in undergraduate and graduate programming?
Yeah, I think that's a great, really, really great question. Something Ingrid and I were kind of talking about a little bit before the talk. I have a lot of opinions about that, a lot of thoughts about that. I mean, I'm someone who really came from, in some sense, like, I'm not sure if it's even like there's kind of like, there are fields, you know, there are disciplines, there are genres, and then there are materials, right? And there are all of these different things, and I think one of the things we're trying to figure out, like in education, we're trying to like figure out how all of those things work in relation to one another, and how you kind of build a curriculum that allows for both the kind of potential and like reality of the way that like conversations are really like spanning across like material specific practice or spanning across disciplines, but then that also create structures that allow for like the depth of exploration that happens, I think, through a genre, through a specific genre. And I think that's depth in a number of different ways. You know, depth in terms of like developing those skills, often very manual, like tactile skills, which I think are really important. You know, they're important to preserve, I think, in kind of a cultural sense, but I also think they're really important. They provide, you know, they affect the way we think, right? It's a particular kind of thinking that we don't want to lose. So I can kind of like think about it in that sort of broad sense. What I am particularly interested in, I think, is the way that a kind of depth in material exploration often cuts across what we think of as traditional, like disciplinary boundaries. So like the Data Clay project is a really good example of that, where all of a sudden people from all these different fields, like architecture, design, art, are interested in this one material. And we come to the table, like we come to the conversation, in one sense, speaking sort of languages that are informed by our discipline, right? And ways of looking at form and ways of looking at the world that are really informed by our discipline. But then on the other hand, we get to have this really kind of deep conversation that happens around like the material itself. So I'm really fascinated by that, like the way that material and materiality kind of provides another sort of structure that I think does, in a sense, both of those things. Like it cuts across, but then it can also go sort of deep into something. Another place where I actually really see that happening is like at CSU in this Fab Lab, where this collection of digital tools creates an incentive for people all across the campus to come into a room, like to be in a room together, you know? And often it's like, so people from biology come over and they want to like print proteins on our 3D printer. That kind of happens pretty frequently. And so all of a sudden you find yourself like having these conversations that were kind of unexpected. And you're also able to talk about, right, like things like form, you know, through the kind of medium of the digital model in a very sort of sophisticated way. You know, we can talk about topology and watertight meshes, you know, and these are things that are meaningful, actually, like both to artists and folks in biology or these other disciplines. You know, they're conversations that wouldn't sort of happen unless that tool set kind of existed. Right?
Yeah, it's interesting. It kind of goes with the argument that interdisciplinarity comes from specificity.
Yeah, yeah.
Not the other way around.
Yeah.
Or like that it's very difficult to achieve.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's this other whole thing, though, that's about, like, tradition. And I think there's something really important that also happens from very traditional practices in the craft. And I'm not sure that, you know, there are practices that tend to sort of become more esoteric culturally because they don't kind of speak that same language of, you know, transdisciplinarity or interdisciplinarity. But I think there are, for example, a kind of certain kinds of aesthetic acuity that only come from very traditional kinds of practices that I also think are really important to preserve. But that's kind of a whole other conversation, I think. Yeah.
Hi. I had a question in relation to the biennales, because I didn't actually know that there were also design biennales, so I'm just curious how long it's been going on, and also the audience that you're getting, because since you're talking about, you know, biologists, I imagine that, you know, there's biologists, engineers, scientists that come, so that could create an interesting change from the other kinds of biennales that we see in the art world. So I'm curious to know about the design biennales.
I actually don't know very much about design biennales. That was an exhibition that Dries Sinclair showed this project to unfold in. So yeah, that's a great, really interesting question, but I don't know much about their history. One thing that I do think is pretty fascinating, and I was just kind of thinking about this, spending some time with Dries last weekend in San Francisco, is that their work, and actually like a particular project of theirs has now been shown in 3 different biennales, a design biennale, craft biennale, and then also a fine art biennale. And I think that's another kind of sort of anecdote that kind of swirls around this conversation around, you know, how work moves between fields, and it's like the same work in some way, but probably each of those audiences coming to it probably read and experience and sort of contextualize it in a slightly different way.
Yeah. What was his name?
Their design team is called Unfold.
Unfold.
Yeah, and it's Dries Verbruggen and Claire Vernier. They're based in Antwerp in Belgium.
Any other questions for Adele? Well, if not, we're having a reception for Adele on the 4th floor, and we're all invited via 407. And now I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Del Harrow for a really wonderful